Or is economics an empirical science of the kind that we find in physics or chemistry? Or to formulate the things a little bit differently, are economic propositions logically derived from firmly established starting points, and hence, if we don't make any logical errors, apodictically true, as Mises claims they are, or are economic theorems or propositions hypothetical propositions that require continual testing and observations? And I want to show also that, contrary to widespread beliefs, these sorts of questions, these methodological questions, are of fundamental importance. They are not trivial matters, and I hope this will become clear in the course of my lecture as well. If we consider the present situation, then we can say that practically all economists, except Austrian economists, believe that economics is an empirical science of the sort that we find in physics and chemistry. Now, this does not mean that all non-Austrian economists actually practice what they preach. As a matter of fact, one can probably say that the better mainstream economists, despite their methodological confessions, do not really practice what they preach, but their minor students, so to speak, they do in fact practice what their masters preach in their few methodological remarks that they make. Now, the Austrians then, who holds the view that economics is a science more akin to logic, and that there is no empirical testing required to establish economic theorems. While the Austrians then are outsiders today, it is worthwhile to emphasize that the Austrian position is a position that until quite recently used to be regarded as a mainstream position. In fact, we can say that until the early 1950s, the view that the Austrians now hold exclusively, so to speak, was considered to be the standard position with regard to what are economic propositions, what is the nature of economic science. The standard position was represented, so to speak, in the general economic professions until the 1950s by Lionel Robbins and his book on the nature and significance of economic science that appeared first in 1932 and then second edition in 1934, slightly revised edition, and that is still in print. I think was reprinted in the mid 1980s. And Lionel Robbins, as I briefly mentioned in my introductory lecture, Lionel Robbins had in fact been heavily influenced by Ludwig von Mises. He had attended frequently as a guest his seminars in Vienna, and you find in his book that no one is more frequently cited, for instance, than Mises is. And Lionel Robbins was a chairman at the London School of Economics, was also the person who was responsible to get Hayek to come to London, and that was obviously based on his view that Hayek was an important student of Mises and that he wanted to promote the Misesian line. And it is the case also that if we go back, let's say, to the 19th century, that quite a few economists in the 19th century proposed similar views as those that were then later on elaborated by Mises. That is Jean-Baptiste Say and Nassau Sr. and John Cairns were all economists that proposed similar ideas. That is to say, the economic propositions do not require empirical testing. They are self-evident truths and so forth. The adoption of the new view, that is the present state of affairs, is due to the influence of modern positivism. And modern positivism is, so to speak, the heir of classical empiricism. That is the philosophy of Locke and Hume. Slightly different version of it. That's why the modern positivists called themselves also frequently the logical empiricists. And these positivists or logical empiricists were initially concentrated in Vienna. Mises knew these logical positivists quite well. As a matter of fact, his younger brother, Richard von Mises, a mathematician, probability theorist, was a member of the so-called Vienna Circle, or as it was called at that time, the Schlick Circle, named after Moritz Schlick, the head, so to speak, of this circle. The circle was at this time rather small, smaller than Ludwig von Mises' own circle of students, and it included such philosophers as Rudolf Carnap and Hans Reichenbach and Gustav Hempel and Otto Neurath, and also on the outskirts of this circle, Karl Popper, who in many ways became the most influential representative of this branch of philosophy, even though Karl Popper adopted a slightly different name for his philosophy. He called it critical rationalism, but in a way, as I will explain later on, there is hardly the difference between the logical positivists and the critical rationalism of Karl Popper is only very minor, and one might regard the term critical rationalism as some sort of trick similar to the trick that is played on us when it comes to the term liberalism. That is, liberalism has become in the United States something that means exactly the opposite of what it initially meant, and critical rationalism means about exactly the opposite of what rationalism meant initially. In any case, these logical positivists, while they were of hardly any influence whatsoever in Vienna and in German-speaking countries, most of them happened to emigrate during the Nazi time to the United States. And given the fact that the European universities during the 1920s were, of course, considered to be infinitely superior over American universities, most of these people landed relatively prestigious positions in the United States, and Carnap ended up at UCLA, and so did Reichenbach, and Hempel ended up in Princeton, and Popper at the London School of Economics, and so forth. And due to the influence of these immigrants coming to the English-speaking world, their philosophy became for decades, so to speak, the dominant philosophy in academic circles. This is no longer true today, but nonetheless, for practitioners of economics and other social sciences, their view are still to this day shared, so to speak, by all textbook authors in economics. Now let me explain what the view of the positivists is. That is, what their basic convictions, the foundations of their doctrine are. And I will take the Popperite view because it is the most prominent one to this day. A basic assumption or the basic tenet of the positivist philosophy is to say there exist only two types of scientific statements, two types of legitimate scientific propositions. The first one is called empirical propositions. Empirical propositions that say something about the world. And empirical propositions, in the view of the positivists, must be, in principle, falsifiable. That is, must be possible, based on observations, to find out that they can be wrong. And experience can be either this way or that way. Or to formulate it differently, we can know nothing about reality with certainty, according to the positivists. Everything that we know about reality is hypothetical. And we need observations in order to establish whether it is that case or it is not the case, and observations then might lead us to discard certain of our hypotheses. And the second type of legitimate scientific statements, according to the positivists, are called analytical propositions. Analytical propositions, however, do not say anything about reality at all. Analytical propositions, in their view, are tautologies. They are just definitions of words. Bachelor means unmarried men. We do not learn anything about real phenomena. We only learn about how certain words are used or not used. Those analytical statements are, so to speak, true by definition. And in the view of the logical positivists, logic, for instance, is nothing but a system of tautological propositions. Logic traditionally was conceived as something that does say something about the fundamental structure of reality. In the view of the positivists, it is just conventions about the use of various symbols. The same with respect to mathematics. Traditionally, mathematics was considered to be something that said something about the structure of reality. In the view of the logical positivist, mathematics again became a system of statements, how to use certain symbols on paper and transform them on paper. In particular, the logical positivists ruled out as completely unscientific all normative propositions. According to the positivists, no such thing as a scientific ethic can exist. Ethics, according to them, was just more like or O, or I like it, I don't like it, bad, good, but there was no way of justifying ethical statements whatsoever. In particular, their view on scientific explanations was the following. Scientific explanations are, in their structure, not different from scientific predictions. All scientific explanations, in their view, have an if-then structure, consist of statements of an if-then structure. If A happens, or if A is the case, then B will follow, or something of that nature. And they thought then that what we do in all sciences is we formulate an if-then hypothesis. If A, then B. And then we engage in observations. We observe there is an instance of A, and then we look out, does B indeed follow A as we hypothesized? If we find that B did follow A as we hypothesized, then we speak, according to Popper, of a confirmation of our hypothesis. A confirmation, according to Popper, is not the same thing as a verification. That is, even if we find our hypothesis confirmed, that does not prove that this hypothesis is true, because of the fact that the term A, if A, then B, A refers, of course, to a universal, is in philosophical terms a universal, that is, there exist an infinite number of instances of A, and B is a universal, there exist conceivably an infinite numbers of instances of B. So even if we have observed B indeed followed A as we hypothesized, this only means, at best means, that so far we have not found that this hypothesis is false. But future instances, future observations, of course, can show that B does not follow A. So confirmations are not verifications, they are just lead us to the conclusion that so far things have not been found out to be wrong. On the other hand, if we have hypothesized if A then B, and A is indeed the case, and B does not follow it, then Popper would say our hypothesis is falsified. We have found one instance that contradicts what the hypothesis says. But what is important to recognize here is these falsifications are also not, so to speak, definite falsifications. They do not show that there is indeed no relationship between A and B at all. They just show that the hypothesis as we formulated it, that is, if A then B, that this hypothesis cannot possibly be right. But it might well be if we add an additional condition to it. If A and C, then B, then it might well turn out that there exists indeed a positive relation between A and B as it was initially stated. That is, a falsification, or even if we find a falsification, a falsifying event, it allows us, so to speak, to maintain the hard core of our initial hypothesis, just to amend it a little bit, add additional conditions that must be fulfilled in order to show that the initially stated relationship between A and B does indeed hold. And then the view of the positivist is that through this process of falsification, we gradually weed out, so to speak, the wrong hypothesis and slowly approach the truth. And another important tenet of the positivists is to say that this procedure of we formulate hypotheses and then we subject these hypotheses to empirical tests, confirm or falsify, if falsify, revise our hypothesis, and so forth, that this process characterizes the conduct of scientists in all disciplines alike. We operate in this way in the natural sciences, and we operate in this way in the social sciences as well. Now, before I come to refutation of this positivist methodology, which at the first impression might sound sort of plausible, this is what the man on the street tends to think about the progress and the conduct and the progress of science. Before I come to the more rigorous refutation of it, I want to just make you aware of a certain number of implications of this positivist research program, so to speak. The first implication I already indicated. It is that there is no such thing as a rational ethics. What we should do, or what is right or wrong, is just a matter of taste. Apart from this, this philosophy of this positivist philosophy involves, so to speak, as I will explain, and adopting the attitude of a social engineer. It implies, so to speak, the attitude of someone who deals with society in the same way as an engineer deals with matter. What is implied in this view, that we know nothing about reality with apodictic certainty, that all we know about reality can be at best hypothetical knowledge, is, in a way, the statement that everything is really possible. And we need experimentation in order to find out what and what not of all possible things is in fact the case or is not in fact the case. Everything can and must be tried out, provided only that one keeps an open mind. Popper's philosophy, he summarized his own philosophy as applied to the social sciences, of course, by using the word of piecemeal social engineering. Now consider some economic propositions and see, so to speak, whether this program or these statements of the positivists do make some sense. Take, for instance, the following proposition. Whenever a voluntary exchange between property owners takes place, both exchange partners ex ante, looking forward, expect to benefit from the exchange. Otherwise, the exchange would not take place. Whenever a voluntary exchange between property owners takes place, both property owners must evaluate the two goods being exchanged as having unequal value. That is, whatever they give up must in their eyes have less value than whatever they acquire. And in order for an exchange to take place, it must also be the case that the preference orders of the two exchange partners must be opposite. That is to say, whatever I rank more highly must be ranked less highly by the other exchange partner. Otherwise, the exchange would not take place. Now, does that strike you as a hypothesis? That is, as something that requires continual empirical testing in order to be established? The first impression is obviously it does not require anything of that sort. Do you think that you will be more convinced of that proposition if you observe more than one exchange? And the answer is no. The impression seems to be that once we have grasped this fundamental insight, we recognize this is true for any type of exchange. We don't engage in any additional empirical research in order to establish it. And this also seems to be quite clear that we would not think that we could possibly experience anything that would contradict this type of statement. Or take another example. If we increase the minimum wage above the market wage rate, let's say we raise the minimum wage up to $1 million per hour, then I would say this will result in massive unemployment. Is this something that we would regard as a hypothetical statement? Or doesn't this simply follow from the fact that we say the minimum wage law outlaws that certain people can strike a mutually beneficial bargain, and by definition then it follows that some people who otherwise would have been employed and some people who otherwise would have become an employer will no longer be able to be employed and will no longer be able to be an employer. As I said before, we have not all economists practice what they preach. Milton Friedman, for instance, who is an advocate of this positivist methodology, would, despite the fact that he thinks everything needs to be tested, and the success of sciences depends on how good we are in predicting things, Milton Friedman, for instance, would declare a person who would want to test this type of proposition, increasing the minimum wage law leads to higher unemployment, as ridiculous. Nonetheless, according to his methodology, the only way to find out whether increases in the minimum wage law lead to unemployment or maybe lead to more employment, the only way to find it out is to test it. Or take another example. An increase of the supply of money, let's say paper money, cannot increase the overall social wealth. It only leads to a decline in the purchasing power of money. Again, is this a hypothesis, or is this something that we can say, once we grasp, so to speak, what money is, we know that this is always and necessarily true? Now, the examples that I gave here show quite clearly that the positivist views to consider all of these things as hypotheses is not at all intuitively plausible. Is in fact something that should strike us as from the outset rather absurd. Our impression is that these statements, if you raise the minimum wage law to $1 million, massive involuntary unemployment will result, or if we triple the money supply, the overall standards of living in society will not be affected at all, that these statements do say something about reality. They help us understand real things, so to speak, and yet they are not hypothetical statements. They are statements that we would regard as apodictically true, as always and universally true. Once we have grasped them, we know that there cannot be any exception to these statements. But according to the positivists, all of these statements that I presented here can only be hypothetical statements. That is to say, if we would say the opposite of such statements, that is, if we would negate them, we would not, from the outset, speak nonsense. Nobody could say, for instance, that you are talking nonsense if I would say, if we raise the minimum wage to $1 million an hour, more employment will result. That might turn out to be false in the reality, but it is not from the outset a nonsensical statement. The same, if we increase the money supply fivefold from one day to the next, and everything else remains the same, if this is just a hypothesis, we can also say that if we increase the money supply fivefold over, we will be 5 times as rich tomorrow. Now, if these propositions are just only hypothetical propositions and require, so to speak, testing, then it should be perfectly clear that there is nothing that can be so absurd that it cannot be tried out, that it must not be tried out according to the positivists. And if they then try certain things out, and things do not work out the way they predicted, let's say somebody formulated, if we raise the minimum wage to $20 an hour, general standards of living will increase, employment will rise, and so forth. And we find then that in reality this is not the case. Then again, remember what I explained before about the character of falsifications. I explained that a falsification does only falsify the specific formulation of the hypothesis. It does not falsify, so to speak, or does not tell us whether the hard core of the statement is correct. So a guy who would observe, living standards did not go up, unemployment actually rose, could say, that is due to the fact that there was another third condition that I overlooked. And now let's control the third condition and try to redo the experiment again under these slightly different conditions. And if then things do not come out right, then you find another excuse and so forth. In addition, you realize that if all of these things are hypotheses, if we can never say from the outset, look, it is absolutely ridiculous to try to create more employment by raising the minimum wage. We don't have to try that out. We know that from the very beginning. If you regard all of these statements as hypotheses, then you see that this creates, so to speak, what we might call a permanent employment program for economists. That is, every type of nonsense you can put into effect, and then you test it, employ, of course, huge amounts of people collecting data, and when the data do not come out right, then you modify your hypothesis and start the next crazy experiment and never learn actually anything. Now I want to come to a more rigorous refutation of the tenets of the positivists. That is, let me just again reformulate their main thesis. The thesis is that there cannot be anything such as non-hypothetical knowledge about reality, or using a slightly different terminology, a terminology that is also adopted by Mises at times, that there can be no such thing as synthetic a priori propositions. That is, synthetic propositions being propositions that say something about empirical things, and a priori propositions that are non-hypothetical in their nature. So the basic conviction of the positivists is there can be no such thing as synthetic a priori propositions. There can be no such thing as non-hypothetical propositions that inform us about the structure of real things. Now, I want to show that this basic proposition of the positivists leads to self-contradictions. And in order to show this, I want to use what is called a self-referential argument. That is, applying their own thesis to their own doctrine. If there are only these two types of statements, either hypothetical things that say something about reality, or analytical statements that don't say anything about reality but are true by definition, if there exist only these two types of propositions, then we have to ask, what then is the status of this proposition itself? That is, what is the status of this distinction? There are only this type of statement or that type of statement. Now, obviously, it can only be one of two things. Either this is, again, itself an empirical proposition, that is hypothetical. Now, in that case, what would we have to say? In that case, we would have to say, well, so what? You might just be wrong in saying this. They have not given us any argument. So, if it is an empirical proposition, they have not offered us an epistemology at all. Or the other alternative is they say this statement that makes a distinction between there's only empirical propositions or analytical propositions is itself an analytical proposition. Then we say, then you simply define your things in this way. But I can define it in any other way too. Again, this is obviously not what we would call an epistemology. There's no justification for this view. And then there is, of course, a third option that they have that would be to say, but this distinction, there is only empirical knowledge and there is only analytical knowledge. that this itself is, so to speak, something that is a synthetic a priori truth. And then they would contradict themselves. That is, that this is a statement that says something that is true about reality, about the reality of propositions, and it is not empirical. It is not something that can be right or might not be right. Or using the same sort of technique, what about the statement, all explanations and all predictions are hypothetical predictions? No, then the question has to be, what is the status of this proposition? That is, all predictions, all explanations are hypothetical. Is this also a hypothetical statement? In that case, we would again have to say, well, so what? I mean, I can formulate, of course, the opposite hypothesis just as well. Or is it just a definition? Then we can say, okay, then I can define things, of course, in a different way just as well. Or is it precisely the type of statement that they deny can exist? So first conclusion, so to speak, is this is a self-contradictory, incoherent doctrine. The next step is I want to show that this program of falsificationism, that is formulating hypotheses, subjecting them to tests, and then revising, either confirming or revising our hypothesis, whatever we might think about its applicability to natural science phenomena, that this program of falsificationism cannot possibly be applied to the social sciences. Let me just briefly illustrate why this is. And let's take an example of hypothesis as you find them in many economic articles and journals and books and so forth. A simple regression equation. This we engage in regression analysis. Let's say here, y is our dependent variable, and we want to explain, and this is some action, whatever, buying sugar or voting Democrat or Republican or whatever it is, and we want to explain that, let's say, by a plus b x, which is another variable, our independent variable, and then we have some sort of error term. And here we have these regression constants, whatever a and b. So let's say we have a set of data, and we established our a constants and our b constants. We computed these sorts of things. And what we do now is we want to subject that to want to replicate our study and subject this to a test. Let's say we find that this hypothesis is confirmed. In a second instance, we find that the A and the B values that we have computed in the first instance are by and large found to have the same values. Or if we find that they are not confirmed, they're falsified, then we would react by formulating a slightly revised hypothesis. Let's say we say y is explained by a plus b in the logarithmic scale of x, so the relationship is not linear but curvy linear, or we say revise our hypothesis saying that is bx plus c of z. That is, we introduce a third variable. That would be, so to speak, the reaction that we have open to us if we experience a falsifying events. Now I want to make you aware of the fact that in order to proceed in this way, to either say we have confirmed it if we find that these things are repeated, or if these things are not repeated, then revising our hypothesis, we have to make sort of implicitly an assumption, a very important assumption. Ask yourself this. Let's say we observe that we get the same results replicating our first experiment. What is necessary in order to say the second observation that we made confirmed the first observation? We might as well say that the second time we performed the experiment gave us the same results as the first experiment. It's just purely coincidental. Observations do not tell us whether we can interpret this as confirming what happened the first time or as just coincidental. What is necessary in order to say the second instance confirmed what the first instance showed is that we make the assumption that causes operate in the course of time in an invariant way. That is, there is no change in the nature of things taking place. Only if we make this assumption, that is, causes are operating time invariantly, the nature of things do not changes in the course of time, can we say this is actually a confirmation. Otherwise, we would just say, okay, in one case it was this, and the next case happened to be the same. But that does not mean that is a confirmation of the first thing. Take the other example. So we observe that this was falsified and now revise our hypothesis. What is necessary for us to assume that that was actually a falsification? It's precisely the same assumption. We must assume that causes in the course of time operate in a time invariant way. If you take the position that causes sometimes work in this way and sometimes they work in another way, then if you don't repeat the experiment in the same way, you would say, no, yeah, so what? That doesn't mean that it was first wrong. All it means is, no, yeah, in the first instance they operated in this way, in the second instance they operated in this way. No conclusion follows from this. To say that the second experiment that we conducted, so to speak, disproves, shows there was something wrong with the first one, requires that we assume in the course of time causes do not change. Only then are we forced to accept the conclusion, aha, then there must have been something different in one instance from the other, and we are being forced, so to speak, to specify what we overlooked in the first instance. Now, then the question that arises is this assumption, that is, that causes operate in a time invariant fashion, that there are prediction constants, that is, constants over time, can this assumption be made as far as actions are concerned? And now I want to show that that is an impossible assumption to make as far as actions are concerned. And that can be done in the following way. Recall, we are explaining actions of individuals here, whatever actions we are interested in. The researcher, the experimenter, the guy who engages in this entire exercise, is so to speak a part of the realm about which he wants to make predictions. He is one of these Ys. He would be one of them who could vote Democrat or buy sugar or whatever it is. That is, the experimenter, the forecaster, is part of the phenomena that he wants to forecast, that he wants to predict. But what we notice here is this, that in order for the forecaster, so to speak, to maintain the constancy in the phenomenal world, he himself must, of course, assume of himself that he can learn in the course of time. That is, the experimenter himself is, so to speak, a different person once he has said, oh, the hypothesis that I had formulated the first time is now confirmed. He knows something that he did not know before. He is now different. Or, if he falsifies it, then he knows something that he did not know before. He is now a different person, so to speak. That is to say, his knowledge, the knowledge of the experimenter, will be different depending on the outcome of the experiment. And accordingly, insofar as the knowledge that he has influences his own actions, we can say that his own actions will be different now, him knowing, so to speak, what the outcome of the experiment was, than he was before he knew what the outcome of the experiment was. This is the entire purpose of engaging in this type of research procedure. That is, that we do not know what the outcome will be, and once we know what the outcome is, we are different than we were before we knew what the outcome of the experiment was. But of course, by engaging in this type of experimentation, he does not know ahead of time in which way he will be changed. So, in order for constancy to be maintained in the physical world, we require, so to speak, an experimenter who himself is variable, who himself changes in an unpredictable way. Only by changing in an unpredictable way, only by learning, so to speak, from experience, can we maintain the assumption that the real world, the physical world, is driven by time-invariantly operating causes. Time-invariantly operating causes in the real world require, or in the physical world, require that we must learn and are variables, so to speak, that cannot be predicted ahead of time. The implicit admission of the forecaster is then that there are no constants on the basis of which future actions can be predicted. Because he has to admit that he cannot predict his own future states of knowledge. Otherwise, why engage in this procedure? He cannot predict what his own future states of knowledge will be, and insofar as knowledge can influence our actions, he can also not predict what his own future actions will be. That is to say, predictions of actions cannot be done according to formulas as we use them when we predict natural science phenomena. Predictions of actions are speculative. There exist no techniques, there exist no formulas, there exists nothing that people can just learn in the classroom and then take home and then use in order to predict future events. As a matter of fact, a slightly less rigorous but always relatively effective way of dealing with those people who think that they can predict the future of action in the social sciences. As you know, in every university there exist, of course, forecasting classes. Is always to ask them, if they are so smart, why aren't you rich? Why are you still teaching at this place? You could be making millions in the stock market, obviously, if this could be done. So the first conclusion that I reach then is that insofar as actions are influenced by learning, by changing knowledge, the social sciences are an art, are speculative. we only know after the event, so to speak, what people know. Einstein, if you ask Einstein, could Einstein predict, so to speak, the relativity theory before he actually knew it? And the answer is, of course, no. Then he would already have had it. So the knowledge of people can only predict it at the moment when they have it, but not ahead of having it. Otherwise, you would, by definition, never learn anything, never change your opinion on anything. But we have also reached a second conclusion, of course. And the second conclusion is, even though we cannot predict and explain actions in the way that the positivists say that we should or can, we have also reached the conclusion that we can say something about all actions, about actions as such. What we have reached here is the conclusion, for instance, that there cannot be any prediction constants that can be used in order to predict what people will do. That is, we have reached an insight that is true for all actions, for any type of action. And this is precisely what economics claims to be. That is, a science that assembles a large number of propositions that are true about action as such, and assembles statements that cannot be affected by any type of knowledge change that might occur. Let me give you an example of this, and again illustrate, so to speak, what we can know apodictically to be true, and in what department of knowledge we are left to entrepreneurial speculation rather than to scientific prediction along these lines. Take again the law of marginal utility as an example. This is one of the most fundamental laws of economics. As the supply of a homogeneous good increases, the marginal utility decreases, and vice versa. As the supply of a homogeneous good decreases, the marginal utility increases. Let me explain what we mean by homogeneous goods. Homogeneous goods are goods where each unit of a good is considered to be substitutable for each other one, where each unit of a good is considered to be of equal serviceability to any other unit of a good. We have, so to speak, identical oranges. Now, we know, again, in a non-hypothetical way, that in every action, a man chooses what, in his view, satisfies him more over what satisfies him less. And we know what we have as the definition of a homogeneous good. And from this it follows that the first unit of a good will be employed in order to satisfy the most highly ranking desire of all desires that can be satisfied with the help of such a unit. The second unit, if we have two units, obviously having two units allows us to satisfy more desires than if we have just one. If we would consider the two units as one unit, then we can say the marginal utility of two units is higher than the marginal utility of an individual, of a single unit. Or a different way to formulate, a larger quantity of good is always preferred over a smaller quantity of goods. And we can also say that the second unit, considered by itself, must be valued lower than the first unit was, because by definition, the second unit can only be employed in order to satisfy a desire that ranks lower than the desire that was satisfied by the first unit. This is a purely logical law. We cannot possibly imagine how this could ever be false. Nonetheless, this law, of course, does not help us to predict many things. What it does not do is, for instance, it does not help us to predict what is considered by various people at various points in time to be a good. It only says, whatever is considered a good, such and such holds for this good. It does not tell us anything about what is my most highly ranking desire to which I will use the first unit of this good. Whatever my most highly ranking desire might be today, tomorrow that might be something entirely different. This can be affected by individual learning. It does not help me at all to identify what your most highly ranking desire is to which the first orange can be employed. It does not help me at all to predict what you will consider to be the most highly valued employment of the first orange tomorrow as compared with today. But nonetheless, at any point in time, for any individual and for anything that is regarded as a good, this law that the first unit of a good, whatever the good is, will be employed in order to satisfy the most highly ranking desire of whatever that happens to be for the person in question. This law holds invariably, universally, and we never need to try it out. Much of empirical research, much of the research that you find nowadays in economics consists of trying to test propositions which we can establish completely independent of any type of testing and experimentation. Much of what you find in the social sciences is people trying to, so to speak, establish by empirical means, by observational means, the law of Pythagoras. Or, let's say, give you another example, much of the research is of the kind as if somebody would say, look, give me a research grant from the National Science Foundation, and I want to find out whether the statement that a ball cannot be blue and red all over at the same time is also true in Australia. I found it to be true here, but I'm not really sure that that is true in other places too, so please fund me and I try to find out whether that is true there too. There are plenty of studies that try to establish that, if you have minimum wage increases, will this actually lead to more unemployment? And some, the lousier economists, so to speak, sometimes find actually that doesn't lead to more unemployment. It leads to more employment. There were recent studies that try to show this sort of stuff. That is exactly as if some guy would have come back from Australia and said, hey, I observed that there was a ball that was red and non-red all over at the same time. The normal reaction would be, the guy must be nuts. What you find the reaction in the social sciences to be is frequently to say, hey, this is really an interesting observation and the guy deserves